As President Trump prepares for his summit with North Korean leader Kim Jong Un, Fox News anchor Bret Baier is revisiting another historic meeting involving a Republican president. 30 years ago this month, President Ronald Reagan went to Moscow for a Cold War summit with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. During that visit, President Reagan spoke to students at Moscow State University. He was optimistic about the possibility of freedom and democracy in Russia.
In this Moscow spring, this May 1988, we may be allowed that hope, that freedom, like the fresh green sapling planted over Tolstoy's grave, will blossom forth at last in the rich, fertile soil of your people and culture.
In his new book, Baier calls that speech a dramatic and significant event at the end of Reagan's presidency. The book is titled 3 Days in Moscow, Ronald Reagan and the Fall of the Soviet Empire. Bret Baier, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
Congratulations.
Good morning.
The New York Times said of this speech, it may have been Ronald Reagan's finest oratorical hour. He had a lot of fine oratorical hours. Why this one?
Because he was speaking in the heart of communism in Moscow to students, young people, about the West and saying why the West is the way that they should turn. It was a moment at the end of these 4 summits between Mikhail Gorbachev and Reagan at which he was trying to reach out, saying what the Soviet Union could be. And it was overlooked, really, at the time, despite the New York Times write-up, as far as its significance. Looking back now, that was a big moment.
Could you talk about the relationship between these two men, Bret? That's what I thought was so interesting.
Reagan and Gorbachev.
Reagan and Gorbachev, that they became Mikhail and Ron, that they really genuinely seemed to like each other, despite their differences and at sometimes name-calling.
Right. I mean, some of these summits got heated. They walked away from the table, both of them.
Waving fingers
at each other's faces. But they had this relationship that developed where they trusted each other. And they knew when they got to the one point, they would step away, but they also had a friendship that developed over the years.
You talk about, let me just go through this, right? You have Geneva in 1985, Reykjavik 86, Washington in 87, and then Moscow in 88. Describe how his rhetoric changed as well, his public rhetoric.
So Reagan, really all the way back to when he was the president of the Screen Actors Guild in Hollywood fighting communism there, always talked aggressively about communism and how it would not work. And he believed eventually in speeches as president that it would be on the ash heap of history and the Soviet Union was the evil empire. And it would be really aggressive, the things he said. In fact, Nancy Reagan even said, hey, listen, dial it back a little bit. But that enabled him, when Mikhail Gorbachev came to the front, to say, this is a guy I can work with.
You know, when you go back to those radio speeches he used to give, this is a thing he thought about his entire adult life, even before he thought about running for president, the relationship between capitalism and communism, freedom and oppression. This was, in a sense, in his bones, so he can make those decisions. Briefing books are important, but he could make those decisions on the fly with Gorbachev.
And that's what Secretary of State George Shultz said was so amazing about Reagan, is that it was his inherent belief that communism was never going to work, that enabled him to get into these meetings and summits and believe he had the upper hand, even if in negotiating he may not have.
One of the things, he's obviously an icon of the conservative movement, but when he first started meeting with Gorbachev, a lot of conservatives thought, he's going to take you, he's going to upstage you, he's going to, you know, why are you doing this? He got a lot of grief from the right.
Because remember, Mikhail Gorbachev was a rock star. He was this young up-and-comer. He was being received by the world as someone who was really great at explaining things, and conservatives were worried he was going to give up the store, Reagan. And that meeting in Reykjavik, when he comes out and he's wearing a suit, and he walks to meet Gorbachev, and Gorbachev pulls up, and he's wearing a winter coat and a scarf and a hat. The image was actually the older Reagan looked younger, and the Gorbachev looked huddled and like an old
And they didn't
Soviet
like
leader.
that. I love the part in the book you made. The point you make, people don't make wars, government does. And when people are free to choose, they will always choose peace. It sure does seem like there's some lessons for us in that.
Big time. And as you look now, you know, fast forward, the last chapter of the book is about Last Word, and it looks at the threats that we face. And obviously, I didn't know that there was going to be a summit in Singapore.
Great timing for you.
It's good. I had nothing to do with it, but
right.
It actually is on June 12th, which June 12th, 1987, is the day of the Berlin speech at Brandenburg Gate, where Reagan says, "Tear down this wall." A line that everybody wanted him to take out in the White House and the State Department, and he put back in. But what to learn about it, I talked to Secretary Shultz in a long interview, who, by the way, is a national treasure.
How old is he?
93.
Yeah, nice.
And he remembers meetings like they were yesterday. And I just want to read a quote, what he said about the negotiating of Reagan. His principles. Number one, be realistic. Number two, be strong. Not just military strength, economic strength. But then, more than that, have strength of purpose. Then number three, figure out what it is you want. Don't start thinking about what other people want, because you'll be negotiating with yourself. Just what you want. Then when you have all that straight, sit down and negotiate. Then you've got the hand to play. Now, this is Secretary Shultz, who was in those rooms, one of the only people in those rooms. And, you know, there might be some lessons to be learned in summits to come.
You sending it over to anybody you know?
No, I'm not, but I'm just putting it out there. I just cover it.
And as a leader, be open to lessons from other people.
Of course. Yeah.
There you go.
So it's fascinating.
Bret Baier, always nice to have you
Yeah.
at the table.
Congrats.
Thank you very much.
Congrats,
Really
congrats.
excited.
What's the name of the book, Norah?
3 days in Moscow.
And it goes on sale when?
Now.
Right now. And when we say it's a very good read, congrats to you.
Thank you very much.
It's also available as a young reader's edition.